listening to BostonFreeRadio.com.
Hello and welcome to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke, and just as a reminder, Words on Film is a show to which you are listening on BostonFreeRadio.com and WBCA LP Boston, watching and listening on Somerville Community Access Television or some community TV station that was kind enough to pick up this broadcast, and then I say thank you as always, or you are watching and listening to me on Facebook Live, either on my own personal page or on Boston Free Radio's Facebook page. Either way you could join me. I'm glad you could join me to discuss my favorite topic, which is movies. And for this show, I have two brand new films to review for you. The other three movies that I'm going to review for this show are films that are not exactly brand new, as in they didn't come out this past weekend, but they came out over the last few weeks, and I'm going to play a little bit of catch-up, as in I've seen these films right when they came out, but I was on break, so I wasn't able to review these films until now, when not too many films came out this weekend. First, though, I'm going to get started with my usual segment, which is What's Topping the Box Office. These are the top 10 highest-grossing films of this past weekend. Many of them are hits, some of them are looking like flops, but I will let you know the difference as I go down the list. And I predicted last week that Glass, the M. Night Shyamalan movie, would be number one at the box office. Again, this week, and lo and behold, it is number one at the box office. It made a decent $9.5 million, a pretty slow weekend. Usually Super Bowl weekend is. And I'm not going to get too excited about talking about the Super Bowl. I will say I am so stoked that the Pats won, but that's all I'm going to say about it. That's all I'm going to say. But in any event, Glass did pretty well for itself. Against a budget of $20 million, Glass has so far made $88.7 million here at home in the States and Canada, and around the world it has grossed $200.2 million, making it a certified hit here in the States and Canada and around the world. So very good for Glass, and it's pretty amazing considering that it cost 1/10 of what an average Marvel Comics movie costs to make, but it still made all its money back and more. So we're definitely going to be seeing more from M. Night Shyamalan, maybe even a sequel to Glass somewhere down the road. Who knows? The Upside, starring Kevin Hart and Bryan Cranston, is number 2 at the box office, having grossed just $8.7 million at the domestic box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $37.5 million, though, The Upside has so far grossed $75.4 million here at home and $81.7 million around the world, making it a certified hit here at home and abroad at last. Miss Bala is the number 1 highest grossing debut movie of this past weekend, but it is number 3 at the box office, having grossed $6.9 million here at home and an undisclosed amount around the world, but that is against a modest budget of $15 million. So my guess is that eventually this movie will at least be a tentative hit, probably by next week, and we may even see it be a certified hit by the end of February. But either way, it's off to a very good start. Aquaman is another movie that fans should not worry about doing well. It's number 4 at the box office, dropping slightly from number 3 last week, having grossed $4.9 million at the domestic box office this past weekend. Against a budget ranging from $160 to $200 million, Aquaman has so far grossed $323.6 million here at home, and around the world it has grossed $1.11 billion. So it goes without saying that it's a certified hit around the world. Domestically, it looks like it is a tentative hit, but it's still doing incredibly well for itself. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, despite getting better reviews from Aquaman, has not actually topped it at the box office in its 8-week run. But it's number 5 at the box office, just like it was last week, having grossed $4.5 million at the domestic box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $90 million, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse has so far grossed $175.4 million here at home and $347.4 million around the world, making it a tentative hit here at home, but around the world it is a certified hit, although it hasn't grossed nearly as much as Aquaman, despite getting much better reviews and better word of mouth from what I've heard. But what can you do? Green Book is number 6 at the box office this weekend, as it was last weekend. And the week before that, it was number 14 at the box office. So it's doing extremely well for itself, especially given how it started. It made $4.3 million at the domestic box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $23 million, Green Book has so far grossed $55.9 million here at home and $81.4 million around the world, making it a certified hit here at home and around the world. Excuse me. The Kid Who Would Be King dropped from number 4 last week to number 7 this week, and it's not looking particularly good for this movie. It did make $4.2 million this past weekend, but against a budget of $59 million, it has only made $13.2 million here at home and $16.7 million around the world. So it's not even close to a hit here at home or around the world, but it may recover, but it's not looking very good for this movie. A Dog's Way Home is number 8 at the box office this week, having grossed $3.6 million here at home and dropping from number 7 last week to number 8 this week. And against a budget of $18 million. A Dog's Way Home has so far grossed $36 million here at home and $51.2 million around the world. So it hasn't grossed nearly as much as Aquaman or Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, but it just made its way to being a certified hit here at home and vicariously a certified hit around the world as well. Escape Room, which is the big horror film to come out of January, and it's still pretty decent, was number 9 at the box office this past weekend, as it was last week. It grossed $2.9 million at the domestic box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $9 million, Escape Room has so far grossed $52.1 million here at home and $96.1 million all around the world, which makes it a certified hit here at home and around the world, and that is very good for this movie. And my guess is we're eventually going to see a sequel for this film. That usually happens when horror films in particular do extremely well. And finally, at number 10, the number 2 highest grossing debut movie of the week, which is a documentary directed by Peter Jackson called They Shall Not Grow Old. I'm going to explain more about this film later in the show, but it grossed $2.4 million domestically, which is pretty good. Against a budget that is undisclosed, it has so far grossed $10.8 million here at home and $12.2 million around the world. I can't tell you what kind of hit it is because I do not know this film's budget.
Building relationships during recovery from mental and substance use disorders can put the strength of family and community behind you. We're all connected, offering encouragement, support, and hope. Join the Voices for Recovery. Strengthen families and communities.
For confidential information on mental and substance use disorders, including prevention and treatment referrals for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Hey listeners, this is Carla from Cue the Sax. Cue the Sax is on every Tuesday from 7 to 8 p.m., bringing you an eclectic mix of music with genres ranging from indie rock to jazz to R&B and everything in between. Keep it locked to Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The first film I'm going to be reviewing for you is a brand new film that was just released in theaters this past weekend, and it is Miss Bala, which is an American remake of a film that was made in Mexico a little while ago. And I have actually not seen the original Miss Bala, but it was a selection for the Cannes Film Festival back in 2011, and it was the entry for Best Foreign Language Film at the 84th Academy Awards that year. I don't know if it was nominated or not, but either way, it received great reviews, and this movie, Miss Bala, is of course an American remake of that, and it's directed by Catherine Hardwicke, and while it's great to see women directing such films, unfortunately, the woman who directed this movie also directed Twilight and Red Riding Hood, the latter of which was meant to be an update of the fairy tale with a Twilight twist to it, so yay? I don't know. But in any event, she also directed Lords of Dogtown, which was pretty good, and The Nativity Story, which I have heard, even though I haven't seen the film, is somewhat of a new Christmas classic. So her repertoire so far has been hit or miss. And the Miss Bala in question in this movie, and by the way, Miss Bala is Spanish for Miss Bullet, and I'll explain about that nickname in a little bit. The titular character in this film is played by Gina Rodriguez, who is an actress who has been in a couple of films, most notably Annihilation, which is one of the more underrated films from last year, which starred Natalie Portman, Tessa Thompson, and Jennifer Jason Leigh. That was a film that didn't exactly strike me as great when I first saw it, but as I began to think about it more, I was really impressed by how it was put together. But in any event, Gina Rodriguez, who is also the starring actress in the Netflix series Jane the Virgin, is here in her first starring role as Gloria Fuentes, who is a Latin American, what denomination I don't know, makeup artist from Los Angeles who visits her best friend Suzu in Tijuana, Mexico. And from Los Angeles, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Tijuana, and I guess people cross the border there all the time. And then when the two of them go to a nightclub just to have a good time, unfortunately, there is a shooting that occurs, some sort of gang violence, and Suzu ends up disappearing. Gloria, again, Gina Rodriguez's character, is fine, but eventually she loses contact with her best friend, despite the fact that the two of them have cell phones. But eventually one thing leads to another, and in the search for her best friend, Gloria ends up getting in deep with a Mexican cartel who is transporting drugs over the Mexican-American border. And initially, when I read the synopsis for this in my last segment of this show, What's Topping the Box Office, I began to think this is a perfect opportunity for a movie like this to maybe make a statement about the border wall and President Trump's policies on Mexican immigration, but the movie didn't do that. Instead, it's just another film that comes out during a cataclysmic time in Mexican-American relations that basically ignores the fact that Trump is president. And I do actually think that had this movie taken on the audacious task of mentioning President Trump and maybe putting his policies to the grindstone, this movie would have been a lot better. Instead, when Gina Rodriguez's character gets caught up in this cartel game, and she's recruited to smuggle drugs from Mexico to America and then come back again, it just became very predictable. And even the action with the flying bullets and everything was just bland, because really Gina Rodriguez is the only interesting actor in this film, and her character is really the only one that's fully developed. The other character in this film they tried to develop more, I know this, is the drug lord who's played by Ismael Enrique Cruz Cordova, who is not a particularly good actor. He plays a drug lord by the name of Lino, who, like Gloria, is a Latin American guy who was raised in America but finds himself caught up in the Mexican drug cartel. And eventually he does pretty well for himself because he rises to the top. But still, I was not very impressed with his acting in this film. I thought the chemistry between him and Gina Rodriguez was virtually non-existent. You could see Gina Rodriguez trying a lot, and I will give Gina Rodriguez credit for having a lot more versatility in her acting than maybe is given to her in other movies and TV shows in which she's been. She doesn't play it one note in this film like other Latin American actresses like Michelle Rodriguez or Sofia Vergara in their various roles. And truth be told, I liked Gina Rodriguez a lot in this film. I think her acting stood out to me even a lot more than in Annihilation. And in Annihilation, she was very good. But unfortunately, she's given a role in a movie whose plot has been recycled. And I'm not just talking about the original Miss Bala from 2011. And I can't make very many comparisons between this remake and the original because I haven't seen the original, which sometimes can be an asset and other times can be a liability. But overall, I just thought that this movie could have made a grand statement about the illegal activities that go on below the border of Mexico, but it doesn't do that. It doesn't reach as far as movies like Sicario or its sequel, Sicario Day of the Soldado, managed to reach. And it could have been so much more, this movie, but it gets my rating of a strikeout, even though Gina Rodriguez herself is great in this film. Had it not been for Gina Rodriguez, I would have given this movie a flunk out, undoubtedly, because just about everything in this movie is too polished, and the drug cartel, the members of the drug cartel themselves don't act particularly well. I was not particularly impressed by Ismael Cruz Cordova, and maybe he's been better in other films. This is the first film in which I've seen him. It's not a very good start for him. I think he just spends a lot of his time stating the obvious, and Miss Bala is mainly a giant miss. But I'd like to see Gina Rodriguez in other things.
Probably okay to have one more drink before I drive home. I'm probably okay. I open the window to stay alert. Probably okay. I just popped some gum in my mouth.
Step out of the car, please.
I probably made a mistake.
Probably okay isn't okay when it comes to drinking and driving. If you see a warning sign, stop and call a cab, a car, or a friend. Buzzed driving is drunk driving. A message brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Diane Wong here, announcing a new radio program. Let's talk about race. From our beginnings as a white supremacist society to our current existence as a white supremacist society, race is a topic that affects us all, and yet we have difficulty talking about it. Why is race so difficult? Why can't we talk openly about white supremacy? Why don't we like to talk about white privilege? Why is internalized oppression shrouded in mystery? What about lynching? What about gerrymandering and the current Black Lives Matters debate? We'll talk about all of it. Come and join us Thursdays from 7 to 8 p.m. Let's talk about race. Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next film I'm going to be reviewing for you is They Shall Not Grow Old, which is a 2018 documentary film that has been directed and produced by Peter Jackson. And Peter Jackson is at that point in his career and his life, thanks in large part to the success of the Lord of the Rings movies and in some instances to the Hobbit films, even though the Hobbit films aren't quite as well revered as the Lord of the Rings movies. But in any event, Peter Jackson can more or less do whatever he wants. And They Shall Not Grow Old is a documentary feature that was co-commissioned by 1418 Now and the Imperial War Museums in association with the BBC, all of whom approached Jackson in 2015 to do this project. And I don't believe that Peter Jackson has done a documentary movie before this. He's done plenty of fiction films or dramatizations, but this is the first one in which he has made a documentary. And he uses all live footage from 1914 through 1918. And it's all footage that he has restored. He, as well as the other people who worked on this documentary, have actually restored and made this footage look amazing. And it wasn't a very easy task. Granted, without computers, I don't think this could have been done at all. But he actually does the arduous task of taking 16 frames per second, which was the standard film back in the late teens of the 20th century and converting that to the current standard of 24 frames per second. And that may not seem like a lot to people who are not particularly familiar with movie styles or certain frames per second, but honestly, if you see a movie that's 16 frames per second and compare that to 24 frames per second, even if it's the same movie, you will instantly know the difference. And what the main difference is that films that are shot 16 frames per second look like they're going in fast forward. In other words, it looks like people are walking very fast and moving very fast and so on and so forth. And one of the main reasons for the 16 frames per second, especially with live footage on the battlegrounds of the Western Front, is that the cameras they had back then, A, didn't have sound, but that's not particularly important for this conversation, but B, there was somebody who was actually turning a crank as they were filming the footage. Of course, that's extremely archaic and primitive nowadays, but that was all they had back in the 1914 through 1918. And initially, this film was aired on BBC Two on November 11th, 2018, which is the 100th anniversary of the armistice of the First World War. In other words, the war officially ended on November 11th, 1918. And I think it's safe to say that all veterans of the First World War are dead. But there's still a lot of archive footage back then, as well as audio interviews from the 1960s and 1970s through the BBC to make this film what it is. In other words, Peter Jackson and his team of documentarians not only took a lot of this footage and made it look amazing, but they also took those interviews from dozens of World War I veterans, none of whom I believe are alive today, and let the accounts of the of the First World War speak for themselves and accommodate the archive footage really well. And They Shall Not Grow Old was unfortunately not nominated for Best Documentary at the Oscars. Again, the documentary category I wish had at most 10 nominees instead of 5. And I actually think that the Academy should consider expanding the list from 5 to 10, because it seems like every year, whenever I see a great documentary, there's always, or whenever I see a handful of documentaries, there's always one that I think is absolutely worthy of being nominated for Best Documentary that doesn't make the cut. And I think They Shall Not Grow Old is one of them, although it was nominated for a BAFTA award for Best Documentary, and it's also given a very deserved wide release into theaters this past weekend. And while not every film, not every theater in Boston has been showing They Shall Not Grow Old, I do think it is required viewing for probably every kid, every high school student who is taking history, not only in America, but also the world. It's amazing what this movie details. Plus, another detail about this film that really struck me as mesmerizing was the footage that actually takes place in this film that takes place during the war is in color. And normally I'm against the colorization of black and white movies, and apparently so is Peter Jackson, but he made a good decision in coloring the war footage here, because it's not so much for authenticity as much as it is for making the war appear as real as it could be to modern audiences. And as a matter of fact, there are some striking scenes in this movie that are in color that really hit home just how cataclysmic the First World War was, particularly on the front lines of the Western Front. And it also details a lot of mundane information about people who, or rather soldiers who stayed in the trenches and fought the war out. It detailed how they ate, how they slept, how they used the bathroom, even though the latter topic is not particularly a great topic of conversation. It is very interesting in the grand scheme of this film. And of course, They Shall Not Grow Old. It should come as no surprise to any listeners. It gets my rating of a knockout. It is a phenomenal documentary. Peter Jackson and his team of documentarians did an amazing job making this film, and they had to whittle 100 hours of footage into a movie that's over an hour and a half. That is incredible how they did that, but it's even more incredible how they restored this footage.
All across the country, people are coming together to speed up what we can learn about health. The All of Us Research Program is calling on 1 million people to join us as we try to change the future of health. For your family, for future generations, for all of us. Visit joinallofus.org and find out how you can become one in a million.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next film I'm going to be reviewing for you is If Beale Street Could Talk, which is a romantic drama film that is directed and written by Barry Jenkins, who is the Academy Award nominated director of Moonlight, which won Best Picture at the Oscars 2 years ago. So this is Barry Jenkins' follow-up, and it's based on James Baldwin's novel of the same name. And it is a movie that, despite the name of the film talking about Beale Street, which is a famous street in New Orleans, it actually takes place in Harlem. And it details the story of two young people, Fonnie and Tish, who are in love in Harlem, New York in the early 70s. And they birth a child out of wedlock. And one of the big things that keeps Fonnie and Tish apart is the fact that the man in the relationship, Alonzo Fonnie Hunt, is accused and ultimately found guilty of rape and is sentenced to prison. And there is not a lot to say about this film and the story otherwise without spoiling anything, but it is a harrowing drama, and just about everyone in this film acts really well. The main characters in the film, including Tish, whose real name in the film is Clementine Rivers, is played by Kiki Lane, and Alonzo Fonnie Hunt is played by Stefan James. And both of them do an amazing job, but the standout actor in this film is actually Regina King, who plays Tish's mother, Sharon, who in one great scene actually goes out of her way to try to clear Fonnie's name and get him out of prison so that he and Tish can finally be reunited. But unfortunately, she finds that his name being cleared is ultimately a lot more complicated than just trying to get the facts straight. There's a lot to love about If Beale Street Could Talk. Again, like Moonlight, it's a harrowing film that ultimately raises a lot of sociological questions, and it can also draw a lot of comparisons to the world in which we live today. As a matter of fact, I think the overarching message, as director and writer Barry Jenkins tries to reflect on the audience, is that not a lot has particularly changed when it's come to the criminal justice system and how African Americans are treated by it in modern day America. And I think it's a very poignant talking point, but it rings of a lot of truth here. And If Beale Street Could Talk is one of those films that was on my short list for being one of the best films of 2018. It unfortunately didn't make it, but I still have to give this film a lot of credit, particularly for the acting as well as the adapted screenplay, for which it actually received Academy Award nominations. Regina King earned her first and well-deserved Best Supporting Actress nod for this film. The film has been nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay, and it's also been nominated for Best Original Score, which is a bit surprising to me. But then again, it's one of those things where the score is one of those things you don't exactly notice unless you're in a musical. But I am still not against If Beale Street Could Talk being nominated for that award. If anything, I wish it could have been nominated for more awards, but again, what can you do? I still think, very much like Moonlight, it has amazing acting, certainly very heartfelt acting, and there were moments where I was tearing up in this film, and I can't even say that I did for Moonlight. Certainly, there were times where I was watching Moonlight where my heart ached for the main character and a lot of the supporting characters in the film, but I wasn't quite drawn to tears as much as I was with this film, and I can't exactly tell you why, but I was still absolutely mesmerized by the film. And even though Regina King, Kiki Lane, and Stephan James take up a lot of the screen time in this film, and it is well deserved. There's certainly a lot of more understated performances by just about everyone in this movie who even makes a brief appearance, including but not limited to Teyonah Parris, who is one of those actresses who's quite underrated and doesn't quite get the recognition she deserves, even though she's had a lot of great roles in movies like Dear White People and Chi-Raq. You also have good performances by Michael Beach, Dave Franco, Diego Luna, Pedro Pascal, Brian Tyree Henry, and the list goes on. And I'm very reluctant to give you any more of an elaboration of the plot than I have just given you, but regretfully, when I saw this film, I had not actually read the James Baldwin novel on which it's based. And one of the things that kind of ruins books for me based on movies is that if I see the movie beforehand, I am just immediately reminded of the characters I've just seen in the film. But with that said, I'm still very intrigued to read James Baldwin's novel after seeing this movie. But regardless of whether you read the book first, I do highly recommend If Beale Street Could Talk. It's a movie that is very sad, yes, but it's also incredibly well acted, and it has a message to it that is not in your face, but will also leave you, let me try to put this in a different way, will make you want to have a very intense and enlightening conversation with other people afterwards. If Beale Street Could Talk, absolutely, I've been beating around the bush about it. It gets my rating of a knockout. It is a beautiful film. Certainly one that hasn't gotten as much adulation as Moonlight has for Barry Jenkins, but it still shows that Barry Jenkins is not a one movie wonder, and I'd love to see what's next from him.
When it comes to parenting, there are no perfect answers. But that's okay, because you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Teens in foster care will love you just the same.
For more information on adoption, visit adoptuskids.org. A message from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
Boston Free Radio has no corporate agenda. We're independent media for the people. Your music, your voice, your station.
Hey, hon, what you doing with your phone?
Do flowers have best friends?
I don't know. Hey, look.
Whoa.
Some answers can only be found in nature. Discover the unsearchable. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a trail near you. Brought to you by the United States Forest Service and the Ad Council.
Hi, this is Joanna Bremis, hostess of The Joanna Bremis Show here on Boston Free Radio at Somerville Media Center. Tune in every Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. Please stay tuned for great music, first half of the show in English and second half in Greek. Thank you.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is On the Basis of Sex. This is a movie that came out in late December of last year. It's one of those films that, again, like If Beale Street Could Talk, which I just reviewed before the break, it was a film that I saw when it came out, but I didn't get around to reviewing it until now. So I'm a little bit late to the party, but On the Basis of Sex is still out in theaters right now and probably will be for quite some time, but it's a film that also comes out after the documentary RBG. However, unlike RBG, On the Basis of Sex is a film about the life and early cases of future Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is portrayed in this movie by Academy Award nominee Felicity Jones. But unlike RBG, it is not quite as good as the aforementioned Academy Award nominated documentary. And I think one of the reasons for that, even though the actors in this film try their best, including but not limited to Felicity Jones, Armie Hammer, who plays Martin Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, as well as Justin Theroux, who I think is one of the better actors in this film, as well as Sam Waterston and Kathy Bates. There was still something missing, and this movie felt a little bit more like Oscar bait than RBG did as a film. But with that said, I still enjoyed it to a certain degree. I just thought maybe the case that's covered in this movie is maybe not the case I would have put to film, particularly because when you see RBG, you see a lot of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's accomplishments ever since leaving Brooklyn, New York, and becoming one of the only women in her class at Harvard Law School. And interestingly enough, as this movie depicts, she attends Harvard for 2 years before her husband takes a job at a law firm in New York City, at which point she transfers from Harvard Law School to Columbia Law School. And from there, she gets a tax law case after she graduates that comes to her attention about a man by the name of Charles Moritz, who is a man from Denver who had to hire a nurse to help him care for his aging mother so he could continue to work. But eventually, Mr. Moritz was denied a tax deduction for the nursing care because at the time, Section 214 of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Code, specifically limited the deduction to a woman, a widower, or a divorcee. No, excuse me, a widower, or a divorcee, or a husband whose wife is incapacitated or institutionalized. So this case that's brought before Ms. Ginsburg, who is a lawyer now, not a judge, is one of the cases that made her ultimately who she is today. And one thing I liked about the film was the depiction of the ACLU, particularly with Justin Theroux as one of the lawyers who works for the ACLU, Mel Wolfe, who I'm pretty sure is a real person. not a composite character in this film. But in any event, what I liked about the depiction of the ACLU here is a lot of people these days, particularly those people who are on Fox News, depict the ACLU as these lazy people who just hear about one certain injustice and just look for reasons to take down conservatives. That's not an accurate portrayal of the ACLU, and I think it's better portrayed here, particularly with Justin Theroux as Mel Wolfe, as a guy who, yes, cares about civil rights and justice for all, but also is deeply intoned in the intuned, I should say, in the realities of the courts and what they perceive as injustice versus what an appellate would have to grin and bear in their court case and in life. And as these movies go, the case in this film, the tax law case, is not particularly in Ms. Ginsburg or in Mr. Moritz's favor. I guess that's kind of the pull here. But the climax of the film takes place in an appellate court, which I found to be pretty interesting. Not interesting in the case that I found it intriguing for the movie, but a lot of these films with these iconic court cases end with their climactic scene in the highest court, the Supreme Court. And I'm not exactly sure why the film chose to focus on a case that only got appealed in the U.S. Supreme Court, but didn't actually show the appeal process. And I think that's one of the missteps in this film where On the Basis of Sex missed greatness. Is it a bit of a cliche to have the climax take place in the Supreme Court? Yes, it is, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as an attorney, had appealed cases before the Supreme Court before and made history, as RBG details. And I don't know why this film missed the opportunity to show Ms. Ginsburg in this movie, as played by Felicity Jones, appealing a case before the Supreme Court. That would have been a great ending to this film. But instead, it had that written epilogue, which sometimes is good for a film, but in this case, it felt more like a shortcut. And it felt like the people who made the movie maybe weren't too lazy, but they could have made that extra effort to dramatize one of the turning points for both Ms. Ginsburg's, Justice Ginsburg's legal career, as well as for the rights for women and men. But it didn't quite do that. And for that reason, it missed greatness, but I still commend the movie for its great acting, as well as its good depiction of the ACLU, particularly by Justin Theroux, and it gets my rating of a checkout. It is Oscar bait, but it's not entirely desperate Oscar bait, but it could have been more.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that our daughters have what they need to grow and learn, but that isn't the case for nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. that struggle with hunger.
Childhood hunger is a heartbreaking reality that Feeding America is working to change. Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste and provides it to families and children in need.
You can help kids in need in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
I love those real sick sons. They're the ones that move me. The thinly blow, neurotic tone, intensify and groove me.
All this and more on Unpopular Music, Saturdays at noon on Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next film I'm going to be reviewing for you is Shoplifters, which is a film that is out of Japan, is entirely in Japanese, and is actually one of the 5 films that have been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and it was also nominated for the Golden Globe Award for Best Foreign Language Film. I don't know to which film it lost, but my guess is it probably lost to Roma. But don't get me wrong, it is certainly an honor to be nominated for this award. And that might sound patronizing, but truly, Shoplifters is a really excellent film. And it's about a group that somehow forms a family that lives in poverty in Tokyo. There is the father figure of the movie, who is Osamu, who is a day laborer who is forced to leave his job after twisting his ankle. There's his wife, Nobuyo, who works for an industrial laundry service. There's Aki, who works at a hostess club. There's Shota, who is a young boy. And there's also Hatsu, who is an elderly woman who owns the house and supports the group with her deceased husband's pension. So these 5 family members who aren't actually related are more like squatters. And as the name of this film suggests, they carve out a living for themselves by routinely shoplifting goods. And the older gentleman, Osamu, who is played in this movie by a Japanese actor by the name of Lily Frankie, and that name doesn't sound Japanese, but the actor certainly is Japanese, and as well as his not actually legally adopted young son Shota, who's played by Sakura Ando is an actress in this film. The young son is played by Mayu Matsoko. My apologies for that mistake. They end up being very good at shoplifting. As a matter of fact, it starts out with one of those films. It's kind of a little bit of a clever con artist film, but then as the movie progresses, you begin to realize how ultimately sad these lives are. But at the same time, you can also understand how these 5 squatters form a family unit. And this movie was made by the writer and director Hirokazu Koro Eda, who became inspired to write the screenplay based on reports about poverty and shoplifting in Japan. I'm not sure exactly how the Japanese economy is right now. I know right now the world economy is pretty good, but still, I think in spite of the economy in Japan, whether it's good or bad, I think there will always be people who are living on the brink of poverty and squat and shoplift to get by. And I think regardless of your background or your familiarity with life in Tokyo, be it in the bright lights of downtown or rather the outskirts where it's the poverty is more evident. I think that there is a lot that is universal about this film to which just about anyone of any background can relate. But there also are a lot of particularly sad parts, particularly when the young boy, whose character's name is Shota, begins to be disenchanted with his family and somewhat fed up with the life of his makeshift family just scraping by and stealing things in order to not make a living, but basically stay alive. So there are a lot of sociological questions in this film, as there were in If Beale Street Could Talk. But again, it's different part of the world, but there are certainly a lot of universal topics that this movie touches upon for the viewing audience. And this movie is done pretty well in the United States for a film that's a foreign language movie and is not released in multiplexes but more art house cinemas, as it was when I saw it. It's done pretty well. It's only made about $2.3 million in the U.S. and Canada, but in Japan, it's become one of the highest grossing domestic films of the year, having made $37.8 million American dollars. And there's a pretty good reason for it, because it's incredibly well acted by just about everyone involved. And you begin to feel for this family, even though you know the way that they're living is not right. Eventually, when they attract the attention of police and social workers, as maybe a little bit of a spoiler, but that's one of those inevitable shifts in one of these films. In other words, the turning point of the drama in this film, you begin to feel the emptiness that comes with a family, even not a real family, getting torn apart. And the ending, which I won't give away, is certainly heartbreaking. And it's one of those scenes that probably has stood out to me the most amongst the other films that I've seen this year. Now, Shoplifters was on my short list of best films of the year, but it didn't make my top 10, unfortunately. But again, 2018, I think, was a great year for movies, because I chose 36 or 37 films that out of this year that I loved and that I thought were great. Shoplifters was one of them. It still gets my rating of a knockout, but it's one of those films that did not make my top 10. But I still had 10 other films that were in that category that certainly deserve to be there as well. And very much like the movie Cold War, Shoplifters is another film that's nominated for Best Foreign Language Film that will probably be beaten at the Academy Awards in just a few weeks by Roma, but it is still an excellent film, and Roma will probably do for Shoplifters what Titanic did for Good Will Hunting and As Good as It Gets back in late 1997 and early 1998. It may not win the top prize, but people will seek it out.
Bad theater seats, cheap Halloween masks, my apartment, all things with obstructed views. Add to these large trucks and buses. 18-wheelers and large buses have big blind spots, and like my apartment, they don't always have the best view. Bus and truck drivers deal with blind spots around the entire vehicle. Always take care not to ride alongside or too close behind them. Our roads, our safety. Learn more at sharetheroadsafely.gov.
Every Tuesday at 3, something special happens on Boston Free Radio. Why, it's Toppers with your host, Gil. Toppers, spinning the tunes that today's youth demand, from Justin Bieber to Lady Gaga to the Fleetwoods, and, on occasion, Hoagie Carmichael. If you missed the program, you can check out the archives at Toppers Radio, that's one word, .blogspot.com. Toppers.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke, and now that I've reviewed all 5 movies that I have to review for this show, it's now time to get into my final segment, which is What's Coming Up Next. These are the films that are coming out in theaters near you, unless stated otherwise, and I'm going to tell you whether or not I'll see them and also what I think of them before going into them. Of course, all of us have first impressions of a film. I try not to say whether a movie is going to be good or bad, although sometimes I really can't help myself. But either way, I will let you decide for yourself. And here we go. So this is a bigger weekend for films than last weekend. I think that Hollywood knows to hold off on releasing a lot of big films for Super Bowl weekend. But this is the first weekend in February where traditionally the bad movies have gotten out of the way for January, and the really worthy films are coming out in theaters now. So the biggest film that's going to come out in theaters this coming weekend is The Lego Movie 2, which is cleverly subtitled The Second Part. So in this film, Chris Pratt, Elizabeth Banks, and Will Arnett reprise their roles from the original Lego movie, as well as, in Will Arnett's case, the Lego Batman movie. And there are a couple of other well-known voice actors who come to this movie as well, including Tiffany Haddish, who, if you can believe it, was not famous when the first Lego movie came out, but she's, of course, very famous now and has a very distinctive voice. So it is very fitting that she be in this movie. And here's the synopsis. It's been 5 years since everything was awesome and the citizens are facing a huge new threat. Lego Duplo invaders from outer space, wrecking everything faster than they can rebuild. This is kind of interesting because Duplo, well, it used to be its own separate company until it was owned by Lego. And it's kind of interesting that Duplo is the villain of this Lego movie, but I love the original Lego movie. I'm not griping about the original Lego movie not being nominated for Best Foreign Language Film at the 2015 Best Animated Film at the 2015 Oscars. It did get nominated deservedly for Best Original Song for Everything is Awesome, and it had a great performance at the Oscars. But interestingly enough, I still loved it, and Lego Movie 2 is a movie I definitely will see, and I'll let you know what I think when I review the movie for next week's show. Another movie that I'm looking forward to seeing, whether or not it's great, I don't know, is What Men Want. This is, of course, an updated version of the Mel Gibson and Helen Hunt film What Women Want. Of course, the genders are switched on this one, where a woman is boxed out by the male sports agency a woman is boxed out by the male sports agents in her profession, but gains an unexpected edge over them when she develops the ability to hear men's thoughts. I don't think I would want to have Taraji P. Henson read my thoughts, particularly if I'm face-to-face with her, because I think she might be offended by what I'm thinking, or she might be flattered. Who knows? But either way, Taraji P. Henson is the lead in this movie, which also includes Kristen Ledlow, Josh Brenner, Kellen Lutz, and Tracy Morgan, amongst other actors. This is a movie I definitely will see. I have not seen Taraji P. Henson be the lead in a comedy before that's not directed by Tyler Perry. So this is not a Tyler Perry movie, by the way. So I'm definitely interested in seeing this film. I will see it, and I'll let you know what I think when I review the movie for next week's show. Another movie that's coming out in theaters this coming weekend is one called Cold Pursuit. This is a movie about a snowplow driver who seeks revenge against the drug dealers he thinks killed his son. It's based on the 2014 Norwegian film In Order of Disappearance and stars Liam Neeson as the snowplow driver, also Laura Dern, Mikael Richardson, and Michael Eklund. Liam Neeson has gotten into a little bit of trouble this past week for a racial slur that he used. So I think this means that this movie is probably not going to do as well. I might be wrong, but I'm going to see it